Hey everyone, so I'm Todd. I'm a product designer and user researcher at Fitbit, and I've been asked to kind of bring these awesome people together to talk about prototyping. We were talking earlier this week about what's some topics that we feel like would be really useful for everyone here to kind of get a sense of how we do things at the different size companies where we are, and so we're just kind of dive into that. So let's start off. It'd be great just to have everyone kind of give a quick background on how they got to where they are now. So. Clarko, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I moved here from Australia in 2008 and rode the wave of the iPhone going bananas. And it's been all work since then. And since I can't take a break from work without getting deported, that really works out for me. I have a computer science background. It's what I studied in Australia. So that helps a lot with the prototyping thing. But I've been a designer since forever that I can remember.
My name is Shahrouz. I work at Pinterest currently. I started in design when I was 14 or so, using programs like 3D Studio Max and Photoshop in horrible, terrible ways, flames. And it kind of piqued my interest in pixels. I went to school for advertising and worked at a traditional agency right out of college for a little while. Doing print and web design. After that, I worked at Apple for about a year, left for Square, worked with Pacific Helm and Jesse for a little over a year, and now work at Pinterest.
Cool. Hi, I'm Maylee. So I guess I first started playing with pixels with HyperCard and KidPix. And then, yay! And then I guess I've sort of bounced around between engineering, design, and prototyping as well. Sort of worked kind of doing some consulting work, and then I worked at Leapfrog, and then I worked at Microsoft, and then I was at Apple for 7.5 years. I understand this visa paper thing very well, because a bunch of that was really dictated by the need of a visa. It really changes your life. Anyway, so yeah, then I was at Apple, and now I'm at the Khan Academy.
Cool. So Maylee, one of the things you were mentioning earlier is how much tools have changed over the years, right? So now in the world of Pixate and a lot of tools that really kind of make prototyping a lot easier. So it'd be great to get your guys' opinions on kind of how prototyping has changed over the past 5-10 years, and where are we now with the state of tools available?
You want to start?
Start? Oh, goodness. Yeah, 5 to 10 years ago, using. It's funny because I think that a lot of people that prototype today or that kind of got comfortable with it, there was a bunch of time when we were using Flash and ActionScript, right? And everybody's like, oh. And today I feel like there's this really encouraging amount of work that's being put into a wide variety of prototyping tools. I think we've got stuff that's coming up that's really about threading screens together, and that's great if that's what you're doing. And then on the other side, the side that I'm especially intrigued by, it's all of the stuff that's at the intersection between art and technology, things like processing and open frameworks. And what I really want to see is have those things kind of come closer together, so that we can start doing crazier things. I don't know.
Yeah, we've been kind of fortunate over the last few years, and I think because of Apple's ascendancy, after the return of SJ, design became a focus of the technology industry. Everybody suddenly got very interested in design as a market differentiator, and so now money is being poured into tools for designers. It was just never there before. Yeah. And it's we get to benefit from that. It's awesome. Whereas, we were all using Director for God knows how long.
Yeah, that's right, Director too.
Coming from a traditional agency background to begin with, my prototyping started out with printing things out and using adhesive rolls and cutting, and I have some pretty gnarly X-Acto knife scars on my thumb. But yeah, it started out for me there, and I kind of dropped off when I went from print to digital, but now I'm starting to get back into it with tools like Framer, and a lot of Clarko's help getting up and running there. No programming experience beyond basic HTML and CSS. It's been wonderful to be able to illustrate to my engineers what I am thinking or what I'm envisioning beyond just pixels, flat pixels on a screen.
And hand waving.
A lot of hand waving.
Motion gesturing.
So yeah, I mean, on that note, it sounds like there's been a lot of times, certainly for us at Fitbit, we deal with this a lot. Clarko, you just launched a product which has some unique interfaces to it, and kind of wondering how you guys have overcome the challenges of perhaps the tool isn't available, and you have to get out the X-Acto knife or come up with some creative solutions to really prototype what you want to test. Wondering if you guys have any war stories that can kind of share with the group here about being creative with limited resources or a new technology that you can't really show easily with an existing tool set.
I'm willing to bet Meili has the most experience with this one.
Probably.
Oh goodness, war stories. I guess I can share a happy thing. I feel really spoiled because I work with Annie Matushak, who some of you may know like from UIKit at Apple, and we actually have like a scrappy little prototyping framework that we're using at Khan Academy. It's on GitHub, but it's not really ready for prime time. And that's, I think, one of the things that we did where, we looked at all of the existing prototyping tools and some of the criteria, I think, it really depends on what you need, right? Like, one of the things that I really love about things like processing is that there's this, and Framer is starting to be like this too, there's this community and there's lots of examples and there's an active group of people that are talking about it. And actually that winds up being so much more important than just the tool. It's also like the people that are using it and the conversations they're having. And so with what we're doing, it's part of the effort is like building up examples for each other and sharing them. And it was just hard to find like a combination of like, oh, we want this to update right away. We want it to easy to get it like on the device, and we want to be able to do like interruptible animations, right? Where it isn't just like moving from A to B, but if I put my finger down halfway through the animation and move it, like I can send something in a new direction. Like, that's still missing from a lot of tools. So yeah, we're kind of, I don't know if that's not really a war story, I guess. It's it's a happy thing. It's kind of a kind of hacky solution that we've done. I'll dredge my memory for anything older than that.
Clarko, do you want to talk about your most recent experience with the product you guys are working on right now?
So this morning at 5 a.m., I hit publish on a website for my company's new product. We are launching an oven, and there is no prototyping tool for touchscreen ovens that have a dial interface. So I think it was pretty much my first week at the company. I went to the garage and grabbed a cardboard box roughly the size of our oven and just taped a phone to it and just kind of started poking at it, wondering if the screen was too small. And we tried lots of different size phones and different size tablets to see if the screen could be the right size. Then we had a lot of long discussions with mechanical engineers about getting a bigger screen. And eventually it's like, okay, well, this thing has a dial, it has a knob on it. Like, how do you prototype for that? And there is a Griffin PowerMate, which is a USB thing for the Mac. It has no drivers for anything except the Mac, though, unless you go and find open source Linux drivers and compile them for Android and then plug it in using an adapter into an Android phone so that you can do that. And it's like the most hacky stuff that we would never have gotten off the ground without. Like, there's so many UI decisions that were critical that were made because we could touch it. Things that looked great in pixels that then felt awful, that we couldn't have tested without touching the thing.
Yeah, I definitely have recollections of buying really super long USB cables and stringing them between rooms and things like that. Where you're like, oh, okay. I guess that's what you got to do sometimes.
Yeah, we've certainly often had people walking around with rubber bands attached to smartphones to emulate some of our more rich interactions, so to speak. So when you see someone walking around the office that has that giant kind of phone contraption on, it's always a good moment of, they're testing something very, very ghetto fabulous, but gets the job done.
That's cool.
I think Clarko touched on something really important. I think everybody in this room would agree that until you put something into practice, you don't really know if it's going to work or not. And I think that's why prototyping is so important to begin with. It gives us an opportunity to feel and interact with our ideas before they become live or before we devote engineering resources to making something happen and it doesn't work. So it's nice that we are starting to make it a core part of our skill sets.
It's also just really fun.
It is really fun.
It means you get to play with things.
Yeah.
How does this feel?
So I know that when it comes up, coding is often something that is someone who's more pure designer sometimes is kind of freaked out about the idea of getting into code in any sense, even if it's something like Framer where it's a little bit lower activation cost. How did you guys get over some of the fears or get over that hurdle and start really diving in to more kind of code and design prototyping?
I think Framer is a great example because it has such a great community, like Meili was talking about. I mean, the fact that I was able to get into it with no JavaScript experience whatsoever and just take some examples that exist and kind of reverse engineer exactly what I needed, little bits from examples to and make them work for what I was doing was great. It took me less than 3 days to get a pretty complex animation going. And yeah, the community is the most important aspect to me. The documentation is really good. The number of examples available, it's really great to see. And it never stops. I mean, they have a Facebook group and there's 200 posts a day. And people asking questions, people asking for help, and a lot of people are active in the community. And I'm sure it's the same for a lot of other prototyping tools.
Yeah, a lot of it reminds me of the early days of the web where you can actually view source and find out how something was built. And that's not so much the case anymore because all the JavaScript is minified and obscured, and it's like everyone's using 40,000 frameworks just to get things working. And it's like you can't just right-click and say, how does this work anymore for a lot of the web. But a lot of these examples where there's a big community and everyone wants to show, I did this and it was relatively simple, and it helps.
I think that stuff makes all the difference, yeah. When you were able to look up an example that's kind of close or a couple of examples that's kind of close and pull things from those lines. I also have to say, it's funny because I studied computer science and engineering as well, and when I started to learn Objective-C, I was terrified. I don't know, I feel like maybe the fear doesn't go away. And it's if I'm intimidated and I've got a degree in this, it's gotta be super intimidating for other people. Even now, when I code a bunch of stuff, when I'm done, I look at it and I'm like, did I write all that? That's great. I did that? What did I? So I think it's also all of this stuff, being courteous to each other and really being conscious about the community, commenting your code and doing what you can to be politely structured in it if you can. I always try and be polite in my structuring and commenting so that other people, if they pick it up, they're not what is this spaghetti? And all those things super help. That and the example database is super key.
Meili, what do you mean by polite in your code?
I mean, sometimes people get really obsessed with doing really fancy things. Look, I've taken these 7 lines of code and condensed it down into one fancy conditional statement, which is when you take an if-then statement and you put you can mash it all into one line for people that don't code. And then okay, actually those are kind of pretty, but then there's other things that I've seen people write these massive one-liner things where everything is all condensed into this illegible code that's it's cool, you're showing off that you can do that, but it's really difficult to read for somebody that's not looked at your code before. So, when programming languages are designed, right, that's the thing that gets taken into account. It's how does it read? And so if you kind of organize your stuff neatly and say here's where I'm declaring my things, here's this thing that changes in these parts of the code, and naming things something that makes sense instead of just calling things A, B, C, things like that. I consider all of that to be courteous coding.
And a lot of that goes into the startup cost of you were talking about Objective-C. I remember the first time I even tried launching what was Project Builder at the time. You create a project and then you're cool, can I write Hello World? And you write it and then you hit compile and it doesn't work. And it's cool, I guess I'll go and read a 4,000-page book now. Being able to just be I'm going to paste this here and it does something, that's awesome. And that's what is so important. Linda Dong, who's a mutual friend of ours, she just posted that amazing Keynote deck the other day because there's just such low starting cost to using Keynote. It's convoluted WYSIWYG, but it's pretty WYSIWYG.
Yeah, for sure.
So what are some of the things that you guys have prototyped most recently, or perhaps that you can share that you've done most recently? Is there anything that comes to mind as a particularly proud project or one that really had impact for you? Maybe Shahrouz, do you have anything that comes to mind?
Well, like I was saying, I just started using Framer, and the first project I wanted to illustrate to my engineers was a collapsing header where some elements disappeared and something stuck to the top, and it was for a website. And the interaction wasn't that complex itself, but once I figured it out and got it to work, I showed it to everybody. I was so proud of it. I showed it to people who had nothing to do with the project. I showed it to my wife. She could not have cared less. But it was like a really like puff up my chest moment for me. Like I really was really proud of it. 'Cause again, like that wasn't something that was part of my skill set before, and the ability to pick it up quickly and then show it to my engineers, who immediately asked me if it was production ready. I was like, no, this is illustrative only. It was really great to see, because we talked about it, we wrote about it, we kind of gave them interaction guidelines for it, but until you see it and play with it yourself, I don't think they got it.
How are you guys balancing that moment of, is this production ready or not, and then why isn't it production ready? It works. Shouldn't this be ready to go? Who are you looking for, I guess, to actually do this kind of work? Should it ever be closer to production ready than not?
Man, I would leave that decision in the hands of my engineers. I don't know enough about our frameworks or how they would like to build things to say, yes, what I have just written in CoffeeScript is good to go.
I think there's so much, so much of what designers focus on is like user edge cases, like how somebody who's using the product could fail while they're at it, and they could care less about the code. And so much of what engineers care about is like how the code could completely explode. And they, meeting in the middle is kind of why designers and engineers work together, and why like engineers who are also good at design are such unicorns. But like, since we're both in our corners caring about our respective things, like saying like, no, this code is terrible, and it only gets 60 frames a second on my like latest generation iMac, you're gonna have to make it get for 60 frames a second on a phone. Good luck.
Yeah. I think the parts where you really want, the parts that you want to be able to export are like, timing curves, or like all the little nuances. Those are the things that ideally, like, yeah, you can just take. I mean, it's kind of like this thing that I think was happening for a while, where people would animate in After Effects, and then someone would try and figure out how to get the timing curves and all the tweaks out of After Effects and like into the code. Just like it's kind of probably a painful process. So I think that's the nice stuff, if you can actually like, tweak enough variables and somebody can take that and put it. But yeah, you don't want to be covering all the places that it could break. That is probably not the best use of your time.
Well, it almost seems like we've come full circle on the After Effects thing, like when you look at the watch, where it's like everything's a frame animation. Don't animate anything in code. It's like, all right, well, just dump every frame from After Effects and how you go. Like, here's 77 pings.
Highly enjoyable.
I don't work in After Effects, so I just have to screen capture a Framer document and give it to engineers.
Which is, by the way, that's a fantastic way, if any of you, well, for working with new input, actually, I think that's a great hack for like, before you actually make it reactive with the input, like you can just, if it's like left to right, you just take your frames and take the X coordinate and then just like map it to the frame number. So it's like a really good tool of interacting through the frames. Like, that's like a nice first step. And then after that, you want to do a proper job. But I recommend that as like a little trick. It's like, you probably already do that, but for other people.
I remember years ago working with Louis Mantia, who's in the audience. He would like build up a prototype in Keynote, and every single frame, including every like tap of a key on the keyboard, would advance the Keynote presentation. And so he'd like take it to our boss and just be like, look, blah, 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 and it's like, it does stuff.
Ship it.
And it's like, it's completely fake, but it gets the point across.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a good moment for selling that, right? Like at that point, someone else can play with it, and say, this does work, this is amazing, I want this product, now. How have you guys been selling prototyping to get the time to even do it?
That's a good question.
I think that's harder in some organizations than others.
Yeah, I feel fortunate. It hasn't been too hard to sell at Pinterest, my manager thinks it's a really important skill to have, especially for our front-end engineers who aren't necessarily as passionate about design as we are. So using words to communicate versus using an interactive prototype to communicate it's always preferable to use the latter. So Mia Bloom has been very much on board with me learning Framer or any other tool. She was actually kind of worried about me learning Framer because she thought the learning curve would be way steeper than a Pix8 or something else, but it's worked out well.
Yeah, I don't know, I think it really depends on the org. Like, where I work right now, it's like kind of mandatory because we couldn't have done anything without prototyping. And in previous places I've worked, there's been such a hard delineation between design and engineering, and it really depends on like the DNA of the company, like who were the first few designers, like were they highly visual or were they highly code driven, or were they where were they on that spectrum, like what was their relationship with the engineers that defines how okay prototyping is. And like we've worked with dedicated prototyping engineers before. It's like you are a designer/engineer and you sit between us.
Right. We had that role at Square. We called it creative tech, I believe. We only had one, but it worked out really well. He was a designer and he would code in Objective-C, and it was wonderful to see what he was able to produce.
I think that's actually another great way to learn. Kind of back to the earlier question, like creative tech and art, like, then it doesn't feel like I'm learning prototyping in my spare time because it's part of my job. It can be like, look, I made a crazy art thing in code that's like potentially like weird, but then it doesn't feel so heavy. And there's this emerging field that I think is really cool. There's a place called the School for Poetic Computation that's come up in New York, and there's organizations like iBeam and Gray Area that are doing really interesting stuff with artists, like creative technologists or technological artists, or I don't know what you want to call it, but yeah, I think that's a great way to get into it. And also then like you really kind of, you see the weird stuff that's out there, and that can inspire you to do something that's a little more unusual in your own UI. As far as getting the time to do it, I think it's also like for us where we are right now, we're part of the project, especially this early learning investigative thing, is that we really want to harness the medium and like use it for what it's really great at, is the continuous feedback, right? And you've got a child interacting with it, like it's got to be really, really reactive to keep them engaged, and so like we just wouldn't be able to do it without that, I think.
How do you set up your testing kind of situations or evaluations with kids?
That's a good question. Like we're just getting into doing that more regularly now, and we actually have a school downstairs, so yeah. So we'll be working closely with them.
Is that by design or just serendipity? It's
by design.
Yeah, very cool. So I imagine some of the people out here, if they are looking to get into prototyping or learn more about it, kind of wondering if you guys have thoughts on tips or resources that might be kind of a great first starting point, or maybe even tools that you find are particularly good starting points.
Keynote is so great.
Yeah. Yes. Keynote. Yay.
Keynote's a really lightweight way to get into just some really basic. I mean, it has all the iOS transitions built in. Flinto is another really lightweight, just based on Pix8 has a little bit more of a learning curve, but it can be really good for a lot of things. And Framer, again, it helps if you have some programming experience, but not a requirement.
Yeah, I think every tool, like you can use it until you hit its limits, and then you're like, you either push it past its limits and hurt a lot, and maybe you do that for like 6 months before you try something new to try and get past those limits.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's good, like starting small, like Shahrouz said, is like super important.
Yeah.
Like feeling like you're going to get over the first hurdle of like actually getting something prototyped, instead of the first hurdle being learn the prototyping tool.
Yeah, totally. I also think it just depends on what you're trying to do. I do like the idea of like using a mix of Keynote, Pix8 type things, and then like, Framer or processing or like some of the more crazy arty things, so that you can you sort of see both sides of it. And that way, like, because I believe that tools, like, your tool affects your thoughts, right? Like your medium affects your thoughts. Like if you tweet all the time, you might notice that you start trying to condense your thoughts down into these like 140 character things. And I think the same thing goes for tools. Like if you work in a like screen to screen medium all the time for prototyping, then you wind up thinking of all of your interactions as being screen to screen, and you do less of the continuous feedback stuff that you can do in Framework. So if you do both, then you kind of, you can think both ways.
Yeah. One of the, I don't remember if you were at Square at the time. Shahrouz and I overlapped at Square when we were working on Register, and we are trying to figure out like customizing home screen thing. And like iOS has like a great customizing home screen paradigm, where icons basically act like words in a paragraph of text. You're just shoving stuff around it. We really wanted to reinforce spatial organization because like it's all about speed and like getting through your customers really quickly when you're running a point of sale. And so like muscle memory is like really important. And so we're trying to like figure out what would feel natural for reorganizing stuff. And it was like a big sheet of paper and a bunch of poker chips, like going around the office. And it's like where it kind of intersects with research, where you're like doing physical prototyping and just like, here, imagine this is an iPad. Try and rearrange those things. What do you do? And they like kind of grab them with multiple hands. And you're like, okay, so you're saying multi-touch is important.
Yeah, I mean, certainly for us, like the setup is pretty critical, and it's funny to see what people actually do with the products. Once you try and set up as best you can, but then grabbing with it with two hands, or in our case, tapping all sorts of things on the device, or certainly setup is an area where for us we see a lot of unique things happening with what people think they should be doing with different devices. So yeah, we've really learned quite a bit from kind of just letting people go with prototypes as B, and even if they're doing the wrong thing, asking the why after that to figure out what were they really expecting has been pretty critical for us.
You do an epic amount of research for new products at Fitbit, like you personally.
Yeah. And we've learned a lot from that, right? So the idea of trying to get people to feel like they are, as in context of you just bought this product, you don't know a lot about it, what are the things that you're going to have to ask to get started with it, have really helped us, in my opinion at least, get a pretty streamlined overall setup process. There's been some pains along the way, but I think we've kind of honed that down as much as possible, and that's only come through prototyping and testing those prototypes. So.
Yeah, I kind of feel like there's 3 reasons to prototype. Like one of them is the testing to see like, does this idea really work, and like learning from that testing. The other thing is communication, right? You like are forced to make this bulletproof replica of how things will work, like pre-replica, I guess, of how things will work so you can communicate it to your engineers. And then the third reason is that you discover new things along the way by thinking in your medium. And that's the one that I think is like sort of the most interesting and like least tapped, I think. So, yeah.
Cool. So one more question for you guys. Imagine that you are looking at resumes and someone says, I am a prototyper, or I'm coming to your company because I want to prototype. That's my skill. What kinds of things would you be looking for in someone who would prototype at each of your respective companies? Clarko, may I start with you?
Man, you could have prepped us on this. Okay, so my company is incredibly small, so that factors into a lot of this. Everyone is expected to wear all the hats. And this has been true of every company under like 50 people where I've ever worked is like a designer can't just be one thing because there are not enough designers to go around. And my company is like 20 people. So a prototyper would also have to be a very competent like production designer and or video editor and or HTML person and or visual designer. And it's like you don't have to be all of them, but you certainly can't just be one because like there's just too much work to do. And I think this is true of any company. Like when the team gets really big, you move in these waves where it's like one person is really busy, and then they stop working for like 6 months, while this other person is really busy. And it's like when you have fewer people, you just have to be constantly doing everything all the time. So a prototyper for a company of my size would mean they have to not just be a prototyper.
Everything in, yeah. all-inclusive.
I'm actually trying to figure out when that luxury becomes available. How big does your company need to be that you can hire a dedicated prototyper? I don't think Pinterest is there yet, and we have, I think, 35 designers on our team. But if we were in that position, I think we would look for not only somebody who can communicate ideas interactively, but somebody who can work within the constraints of the platform that they're designing for. They're taking designs from and trying to communicate them. But that's a good question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
I think it's interesting because I think we talk a lot about hiring on skill, and at the same time we've been reading all of these things about how like a lot of times they've noticed that when young women look at lists of requirements for things, if they don't meet all 10 of the 10 requirements, they don't apply, and they kind of say like, oh, I don't meet all those requirements. Well, it's like a lot of men will see like fewer of those and be like, oh, I can do the rest, I'll figure it out and apply. And so, and I actually, on the hiring side, I've started thinking about things kind of differently, because I feel like when people are interested in growing, when they're really hungry to learn, and they're so hungry to learn that they're open to feedback, they're not defensive when they get feedback, they're proactive about like grabbing new tools and getting documentation and asking for help, like that actually winds up being more important than just the raw skill. And I also think that like a lot of people that are really good at something, like doing that over again in their next job might not be as interesting as like being given the opportunity to learn a thing that they've always been dying to learn. So I actually feel like for me, it's like people showing that they've taken the right steps, that they're gonna get there. Not necessarily that they're there already and they're like showing me all this whiz-bang stuff. Like that's awesome, right? If you can do that. But I also feel like it's more important that they're thirsty to learn more and thirsty to like get the feedback and get better. So yeah, that's kind of how I think about it. I think the other thing is also like looking for people that aren't so obsessed with tools that they've lost sight of like why they're building the thing, because there can be a lot of that in our industry. It's like, oh, it's like, well, I use this feature of this tool, and it's like, well, yeah, but like what? What was the purpose of it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's cool.
It's just released 4.7. It was a new feature. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, we have a few minutes, so we could take some questions from the audience, perhaps.
Low battery.
Oh yeah, so actually the other thing, the other thing is like for people to be thirsty about it and show the ability to systematically think and organize their information. I think that's the other thing. It's like, what I look for in more junior designers that are learning, it's like, okay, when you're approaching this problem, were you approaching it systematically? Like, did you gather stuff, lay it out, or like research, make sure that you understood the goal of what this was going to be used for, or were you systematic about how you iterate, how you look at your iterations together, like all those types of things. And are you proactive about making situations better when they get bad? I think that's another thing that I really look for in like anybody that I hire. It's like, tell me what you like, tell me what you didn't like. And if you're like, oh, I didn't like working at this one place because everybody was terrible all the time and they all sucked and it was so bad. Like, and then I say like, well, what did you do about it? Like, tell me more. Like those kinds of things are the things that, at the end of the day, we're all like humans working together, and those team dynamics matter sometimes so much more than the raw skill. Because the raw skill, like people can learn. The attitudes, like this can be harder to change.
Yeah. Ever ended up on the hiring side of the chair? Mm-hmm. It's always been more about the like, all right, let's work on a problem together and see how you approach the problem. Like, see how you even think about it.
Totally.
Just with a blank whiteboard.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, this is true of like everywhere. Like, you could look at any of our work, and 80% of what it looks like is not our doing. Like, we're all working in huge teams, and like the branding is not our decision, and the typography is not our decision. The platform guidelines weren't our decision. Like, we're all just working in a very big team, even outside of our companies. And it's like, looking at portfolio work is almost useless. I don't want to say that because portfolios are important, but so like you can't just do a portfolio review. You have to actually like chat with someone and get some feel of how they think.
Yeah, yeah. And somebody can have an amazing, like the most amazing portfolio in the world and be a terrible person to work with, right? You can also, I mean, it's true. It doesn't mean that you want to work with someone like, and I've seen a lot of people say that in like leadership. Just hiring is so important because, like you said, we do things in big teams, so like that matters more.
All right, cool. I'm out in the field. I have a question. Well, I don't have a question. He has a question.
Hi. I like prototyping. I like when it's cheap and easy. And at the same time, I was impressed with origami from Facebook team. And just a question what you think about it, because first time from my point of view, it was like overcomplicated. But now when you can export this prototype into code, and you can first try animations in this origami and then put it in a real product. It kind of makes sense now as a way to really build stuff. So can you have any question, any input about that output? Sorry.
Was it just what do you think of origami? Is that the question?
The question was what they do. The question for panel was about origami. What do you think about origami? Is it are you use it? Does it make sense for you?
Sure.
So we don't use origami personally at Fitbit. Some people have certainly played with it, and some people actually know it pretty well. For our purposes, oftentimes there's just other tools that end up being better or people have more experience with. So that's just the reality of us and our team right now.
Yeah, I think a lot of tool choice comes down to your personal level of comfort. I gravitated towards Framer because I used to do web development, so I'm okay with JavaScript. I'm terrible at JavaScript, but whereas Brad Ellis, who is somewhere in the crowd, who was up here showing Photoshop off earlier, he loves Quartz Composer, and so like origami fits very naturally into that workflow. And he is not a developer, so it's just like, I don't know, we all gravitate towards tools early in our careers, and hopefully we branch out more, but more likely we like really polish those tools.
And hopefully we don't stay stagnant. I mean, like you were saying earlier, if a tool stops being useful or stops doing, or you've taken it to its limits, and we can adapt and learn something new. I personally got into Framer with no programming experience because I had this guy to help me out.
See, the people make all the difference.
Yeah, they really do. Yeah, I worked with Brad at Square and then at Pacific Helm, and he knows Quartz Composer better than anybody I've ever seen, and he can do some pretty amazing things with it. And origami is really nice to see somebody supporting what is essentially abandonware. I haven't used it personally, but I've seen the things it can do, and it's pretty incredible.
Yeah, for me, like sort of, I honestly haven't looked at the update, but I think Quartz Composer is really fun. It's a really fun way to get into stuff, especially if you're too intimidated by code to start out with. But part of the reason we chose to steer clear of it when we were checking out prototyping tools was because of collaboration. Like, I don't know if you've ever seen, what's it called? I think there's a website called scriptsfromanotherdimension.tumblr.com, and it's like these screen caps of these terrible visual programming layouts that have got like boxes and lines, and it's just completely incomprehensible. So if I like made a complicated thing and I handed it to you, you'd have to look at it and be like, wait, can you walk me through this? Because, well, it's like, again, like regular programming tends to have like some sort of common courtesies that you do when you lay things out, and I feel like visual programming doesn't as much, and so that's why we stayed clear of it. But I still think it's fun. Like I don't know. I just kind of pick up whatever tool I feel like, depending on what I'm working on. If it's something that's more like, it's just easier to do in processing because it's, I don't know, if it looks like other common processing-y things, I'll just like do it there, or like, and then, if it's something for the web, then it might be easier to do it in like HTML and CSS. I don't know. I'm kind of not attached tool-wise. I do like our prototyping framework. I've been having a really good time with that though. That sing through touch thing earlier was done in our prototyping frameworks.
All right, we got another question right here.
Thank you. So this is, I guess, a quick one. Do you think that prototyping is kind of like more important at the beginning of the process, like in your whole process from, like when you're concepting an idea to when you ship it out the door? Do you ever stop prototyping, or is it like it's like more important at the beginning, or it's sort of like just an ongoing thing as you keep going through new features and kind of like even getting closer to launch, you still find yourselves prototyping?
Do you want me to? So the diagram that I was showing earlier, which sort of shows the branching out, like the generative aspects of design, and then the culling, like the being your own worst critic and stripping things down. Sometimes to like actually convey an idea, you have to prototype it, and in that case, it happens right at the beginning. Some ideas, like you can draw it, and people understand pretty well what it's going to do, and then you can just stick to a drawing. I think at that stage, I tend to use prototyping if it's like the idea will simply not shine through a drawing. The other aspect is like, if that idea is leading to other things and I'm actually exploring through prototyping, then I think that's pretty essential. Then when you get to the point where you like need to spec a thing for engineers, it really depends on the relationship you have between engineers and designers. If you're really knitting a bunch of relatively standard screens together, like you could probably just use Keynote and be like, does this flow make sense? If you're trying to do something more complex, then you may actually need to be prototyping all the way to the end. On this last project, the iPad app that Khan Academy shipped in January, there were parts of it where we were doing a lot of tweaking of timing curves and stuff like that. But Nacho Soto, who's an mobile engineer on our team, and I we just sat down together and like worked really, really closely. And because it's a small team, we have that relationship. I didn't need to go make this like bulletproof prototype. We could just sit side by side and tweak it. But I think if that hadn't been the situation, I might have had to do more. So I did enough to give him a really close idea, and then we did the final tweaking together. It just really depends on the idea. It's kind of less about the process and more about the interaction.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, part of that is building a good team as well. So we've also moved to a model where our design team is really integrated with our engineers. And so certainly at the beginning, you have the chance to really kind of think big and show process flows of what's going on. But then at the point where you're really just worrying about minutia of the animation, being able to just, again, sit down with them, because we are a tight-knit team, has really been nice, just because it's way faster to do it just once rather than prototype, then code.
Yeah. To Mei-Li's point about like idea generation and then culling, if you're working within a standard-ish framework, like if you're building an iOS app and it looks like an iOS app, like if it uses a tab bar, if it uses a nav bar, you know what that looks like. If you can point at any other example in the world and say it's like this, then you've saved yourself all the time of prototyping it. But if you can't, like if you're actually inventing something new, then you kind of have to, because you don't know if it's going to be any good until you've tried it. And that's something that's always kind of like, when you think about how iOS must have, like the very early days of iOS must have been, or like watchOS, where it's just like, all right, we don't know what this is like yet.
Yeah.
It seems like a good idea, but we're not going to know until we try it. Yeah. And you have to prototype it at that point, like very early in the process. But I think to your question, there's a huge amount of prototyping to be done late in the process just for polish. Like, if you can get the timing curves right. And it really depends on how busy your engineers are on other things.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
Or whether you can sit down with them or not.
Yeah. Because I just kind of got more into it recently, I find myself trying to find excuses to prototype. So I'll look at any part of a design, like, can I make that real?
I can give you some stuff.
I'm sure that shine will be off the apple at some point, and I'll have to actually do real work again. But I think it really depends on what the project needs, and like Mei-Li was saying earlier. If you need to prototype something to get an idea out and throw it away, or if you've already gone past that point and you've got a design ready to go and you need to illustrate it to your engineers. I mean, there's different requirements or purposes behind prototyping, and it really depends on what the project needs.